I'd like to introduce now Mr. Phil Duncan. Phil is a proud Gamilaroi man from Moree, and that's in outback Australia. He has extensive experience in working with community and government to enable Indigenous voices in decision-making, particularly in natural resource management. Thank you, and over to you, Phil.
Marabu, Carleen, I would like to say Yamaninda, Phil Naya, Gomeroi Mari. That's hello and welcome. My name is Phil Duncan. I'm a very proud Gomeroi man. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge my sisters, Dr. Virginia Marshall and the Honourable Carleen Maywell. It's wonderful to share the stage with you. I too would like to pay my respects to the many nations across Australia, those globally, and particularly this country where we have had a wonderful cultural experience walking across the lands of the Egyptian people, and pay our respects to the elders globally, and trust that we all share a vision of a prosperous and reconciled future where our Indigenous knowledge is at the centre of what we do together. I want to acknowledge the artwork done by Faye Mosley, who grew up in Cootamundra Girls' Home. Faye uses her art for healing and education, particularly of the next generations. We, as Aboriginal people, have always asserted that we are decision makers. We have sound governance. That has been a part of our lives, part of all our lives since time immemorial. And we have cultural protocols and law, LORE and LAW, that guide us in how we interact with our country. And globally there's been this movement about nothing about us without us. And it's based on the precipice or principles of self-determination and self-management and decision-making. And we use our totems, our artwork, and our meeting places to help guide those conversations. I want to point out that the rivers, the artwork is that of the Darling River, called the Barker, by the Barkindji people, the Murrumbidgee, and the Murray, that has many names, and the one that I'm fond of is the Dungala, which is what the Yorta people call it. I want to acknowledge Mullion, the wedge-tailed eagle, one of our strong totems of my nation and my culture. Strength, wisdom and protection, and trust that Mullion will be looking over us today. Our meeting places, and just prior to starting, my Bawa Virginia pointed out that, gender equity, and our women's voices are so important in our way of life and how they care, not just for family, but for community and country. And a lot of our water knowledge is with our women. So I want to point to that image in the middle where we've actually got men and women sitting as equal around our governance table. And the top right-hand image is that of our meeting places where we come together from different nations and many parts of country to be together. And that's usually around a wetland. And now wetlands are our supermarkets. Not were, they still are. So the protection and keeping them alive and vibrant will help us sustain our cultural way of life and those cultural responsibilities and obligations that we have to care for country. I want to share this image, and I want to talk a little bit about cultural science. This image is done by Robert Zooks. He travels the world and makes these amazing maps with each country's arteries and veins. You call them rivers and anabranches. And our cultural science, and I want you to think about that branding, the cultural science, it's based on a narrative. If I can just go back one, please, Catherine. Our cultural science, yes, it is a narrative, but it's interwoven into our art, our song, our dance, our language, and how we teach that transgenerationally from the past to the present and will continue on into the future. So I just want to go back again. So talking about our cultural science and educating our collaborators is important to us, because I believe it shouldn't be on us alone to realise our potential, but it should be with us. And I believe that this is a great image of that collaboration. I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, building our champions' cultural capacity and confidence is important for us, because we know that people want to not just talk with us, they want to walk with us. I'm going to share a bit of knowledge about my grandfather. I come from the northern part of the Murray-Darling Basin, a little place called Moree, and my traditional lands are Terry Hi. And the tree that my grandfather was born under in 1929 is still there, alive, breathing. It's our place, my place in particular, where I go to replenish my cultural soul. But my grandfather said to me, you know, young fella, this Murray-Darling Basin, our nations and the adjoining nations, we are the lungs of the basin. And I want to just outline what I'm talking about. Is that shaped like a lung? And then I got to sit on the Dungala with Uncle Colin Walker, and we were talking and talking in the mirrors, and he said, yes, he said, and we are the kidneys. So when we talk about our cultural science as a narrative, we recognise country as a living, breathing entity, and water's centrality to its sustainability of our Indigenous food security, particularly our native fish, and places our cultural sites of significance. Water's centrality to that is important. Its centrality to our cultural way of life, as I've said before. So using modern day technology to not just educate, but using it for now, but into the future, helps us create a greater understanding and a deeper sense of, well, a deeper understanding about this cultural way of life. Because we believe that our cultural science can be the very game changer and is the missing ingredient. Not could be, it is the missing ingredient. And that's not just an Australian thing. I think we believe it's a global opportunity to integrate cultural knowledge. But coming back to Australia, and our collaborators that walk with us, Carleen and I have got a 30-year relationship, and we've stayed strong, we've stayed focused, and we are now realising the benefits of that focus and the continuous messages about strong collaboration and what it looks like. So next slide, please. And I want to point out our journey. So this is just a timeline graph of water management in Australia. And if you go back to the 1960s, the 1970s, you'll see that it's been sparsely populated. Then we hit the 80s and we start with land rights, and then we hit the 90s with native title. And as we progressed through, I've deliberately changed the colours of the bar from stop to amber and blue for water. And now if you look at the end of this graph, or this timeline, it's become more densely populated. And that is directly related to the type of collaboration, but our ability to influence the decision makers to give us an opportunity to realise our potential as leaders in natural resource management, but not in isolation of our champions. So I want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Ampolina and Associate Professor Brad Mogridge for assisting in putting that. But just to highlight that we shouldn't be doing things in isolation of one another. One of the certain things about the future is we're going to have less resources to work with, but what price do we put on our ability to share our knowledge? To share the journey, to share the load, the highs and the lows of that journey. But together we can do it. And last slide, please. And we don't have a word for goodbye, so because it's definitive. We say yay, which is we'll go. And I hope that, well, I don't hope, I know my sisters will continue some really strong messages about us as Indigenous people and the strength of collaboration from a whole of community approach, you know.
Thank you very much, Phil. And as you can see, it's a very powerful story. Recently, the Australian Water Partnership, which is an Australian government initiative to actually give voice to the Australian water story, our reform journey and our relationships in actually improving the way in which we manage water. The Australian Water Partnership is why we're here today. The Australian Water Partnership has brought us here and brought us together as part of a story that tells how our collaborative approach in Australia has improved dramatically and how it is making a big difference to how we manage our natural resources. Recently, the Australian Water Partnership commissioned 2 pieces of work. One of those was on community and stakeholder engagement since colonisation, and one of those is around Indigenous voices and 60,000 years, as I said before, of treading lightly, softly, sustainably and in balance with the environment. Since colonisation, we've done a great job in destroying that environment. For 233 years, we have engineered, controlled, tamed and tried to access the wealth that water can generate for our country. And during the 80s and 90s, the realisation right across the nation was we need to change. We had over-allocated our water systems, we had destroyed our connection between the sustainability of the landscape and the productive capacity of that landscape. So what did we do about it? Currently, we have what we call the Basin Plan in Australia, which is a $7 billion plan that is looking at resetting the balance between productive extraction of water, environmental sustainability, and cultural access to water. We've got a bit of a way to go on that last one. But how did we do that? How did we just flip from where we were to actually developing a basin-wide plan in a basin that's over 1 million square kilometres in size, and with 1.3 million, over 40 Indigenous nations and communities from all around the world? Australia is a melting pot of nationalities. In the Murray-Darling Basin, at the top of the basin, it's a very, very different culture than it is down the bottom of the basin. And that's in Indigenous culture and white Australian or colonialised Australia or the immigration wave. So what we had to do was we had to work really hard over a 30-year period to bring our communities along on the journey towards a better way to manage water. And during the late 1990s and early 2000s, Australia and the Murray-Darling Basin in particular was in the grips of a really serious drought. We call it the Millennium Drought because no one in living memory had seen a drought to the extent and the depth of this. For the first time in living memory, critical human needs water was at risk. Cities were looking at running out of water. And at that time, I was the Minister for Water Security at the bottom of the Murray-Darling Basin in a state called South Australia, where the city of Adelaide came perilously close to running out of water, not being able to supply our community with drinking water. So what did we do about it? We called a crisis meeting. We set aside the agreements that we'd been working on, and we had to actually negotiate between the states and the federal government a better way of doing things. And to do that, the first thing we did was we actually said we need more information. We need to know how we're going to go about fixing this, and the first thing we need to know is how bad is the problem. So there was a general agreement, and this is the first step and the first stage, is a general agreement that there was something wrong and the system was over-allocated. And we got agreement from everyone, every state and the national government, the Australian government, that that was a problem. And from there we said, what size is this problem and then how are we going to go about fixing it? So our National Research Agency, the CSIRO, was commissioned to do a sustainable yields report on each and every one of those little veins in the Murray-Darling Basin that you saw on Phil's slide earlier, and to put together a report that would tell us how much water we needed to recover from productive use and extractive use and put it back into the system to manage the environment more sustainably. Now, we knew we couldn't go right back to how the time before white settlement, because I guess the system had become a working river, and there were so many communities, families and the economy of Australia that depended on the Murray-Darling Basin. So the federal government, at the same time we did that Sustainable Yields project, put that $7 billion on the table. And that brought all of the states together to negotiate a better way forward. We ceded powers to the federal government, that's the state governments, ceded powers to the federal government to enable them to be able to do a strategic plan at the national level. We negotiated priority projects that could be funded from the $7 billion. And we went into the water market and we purchased water back from irrigators to put back into the environment. The plan actually sets the principles by which we will recover water. It sets how much water we need to recover, and it sets the standard on which the states need to develop their water allocation and their water entitlement processes. So what happened? We agreed to all of this, and then we went about the business of trying to implement it. And we established what we call the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and it replaced the previous mechanisms of governance, which was the Murray-Darling Basin Commission. The Murray-Darling Basin Authority went about developing a guide to the basin plan so that we could have public consultation about what it would look like and how we would get to those goals. They made one fatal mistake. They forgot to include community. They went away and they did an enormous amount of work on the science. They did an enormous amount of work on the technical aspects of water recovery. They actually did an enormous amount of work on how the centralised government from Canberra thought it would be the way to recover water without consulting communities. They thought the guide would be the beginning of consultation. What the community saw when the guide was released was a fait accompli, and they reacted violently. Communities across the basin firmly rejected the guide to the basin plan. And as you can see from the photographs, piles of the guide were burnt in the street. And so the federal government and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority had to go back to the drawing board. And the one thing that they learnt that they needed to do was to sit down and engage deeply with communities and deeply with state governments. In doing that, it meant that it took from 2007 to 2012 before we finally got a basin plan agreed. And that agreement occurred in 2012. It was hard work, and it was absolutely controversial at every single step of the way. But the plan was agreed in 2012 following an exhaustive process that enabled us to actually get agreement on a compromise position. It is not perfect, and it is still a journey, but it is the first time in the world that any nation has actually embarked upon a recovery plan this size and at this scale. And to this very day, the plan remains in place and is still continuing to be implemented. The low-hanging fruit has been achieved. We're about 80% of the way there on the first iteration of the plan. We've got about 20% to go, and that 20% is really hard work. And one of the issues that is of concern at the moment is it's now becoming controversial again, and because it's really hard, the last bit to do, communities are starting to be outraged again. And they're looking at thinking that they have done enough. And so there is now a process in place where the authority and other people in this space are trying to re-engage with communities to bring them back along on the journey. The one thing in the Basin Plan, and Virginia will speak to this later, so I will not dwell on this, is that the Basin Plan did not engage with Indigenous communities at all. And that was another really big failing of the process. But it is a failing that has been recognised. And Australia's story is one about failures and learnings. And it is really important to note that our success comes from actually learning where we've failed and embracing where we've failed and moving to the next step forward. And this is what we're endeavouring to do with these last few years of this plan and where we're going to move for and what the next plan looks like. Lots of conversations happening in Australia, and the journey continues. So what we have learnt, though, is that if you don't put people at the heart of everything you do, and that includes all people, it includes the broader communities of the basin, the Indigenous communities of the basin, the women of the basin, and the men of the basin. My story is one of working in water as being surrounded by men in the early days. In politics, every time I sat down around a table for negotiations, it was all men bar me. We need to have stronger gender voices and a balance in those negotiations. And it is difficult to do because it is complex, it is hard, it requires resources, and it requires investment up front. So during the process, what we have to come to realise is that there will be conflict. And it's just like in every household. We all don't live happily in our own home and never have an argument. So why would we expect, in the context of a basin that's over 1 million square kilometres, that have people that have never met each other, would all agree? And how can we expect that communities will have the same position? And we should not for a moment say that there should be an Indigenous voice. There are many Indigenous voices. There are many community voices, and they need to be around the table. So bringing people together with divergent views is critical in the process, and we need to accept that conflict is part of the process, not try to avoid it. Embrace it, because actually understanding what that conflict is all about gives us the opportunity to sit down and work out how we navigate our way through that. So in the development of the Community Voices document, which the Australian Water Partnership has commissioned, we did a case study on the Murray-Darling Basin, but also on another number of other reform journeys in the Australian water story. And from that, we've distilled a number of principles that we think are really important for community engagement. So I'd just like to quickly now go through what we found through that exercise. So the first one that is, you need leaders. And that does not mean political leaders. It means creating leaderful communities. It means investing in the capacity of your local people to actually understand the complexity of what you're trying to achieve, the complexity of the issues that communities face, and the complexity of the relationships that need to be built. It is unlikely that one individual will have all of those skills, so you must be able to invest in communities to develop a cohort of leaders that will be there long past when the government officials come into your community and tell you there's a problem and they're going to fix it. Those community leaders will be there for the long term, and they'll be a ready cohort, ready to embrace change in the future when needed, if they're given the capacity to do so. The second principle is building trusted relationships. The experience from the Basin Plan is that during the development of the guide, they did not develop trusted relationships with the communities to whom they were about to impose a reform agenda on. And so those communities did not trust the process in any way, shape or form. And it takes time to build trusted relationships, and it takes no time at all to lose that trust. So investing up front in building those relationships, and don't fly people in and fly people out and expect communities to feel confident in the process. Don't do your modelling and your research in isolation of communities. Involve those communities in establishing the principles on which that research is going to be undertaken. Involve them in the collection of data and involve them in the process of understanding what's being researched and why. One of the big failings of the Basin Plan was all the modelling was done in black box modelling, I call it. Nobody knew what assumptions were used. We just were told what the outcomes were. And the outcomes are this, so therefore you must believe us. People didn't believe. And so you have to actually build those trusted relationships through involving people at the very beginning. It is not the thing you do at the end, community engagement. It is the thing you do at the start. And it is a thing that you must invest in before even thinking about what is required to deliver the solution. So the third principle is you need to be clear and have clarity of purpose about what you're actually doing. You need to know, communities need to understand why the reform purpose is needed and what their roles are in the process and who has responsibility for what. And that really matters in the negotiation process. Understanding where you fit, how you will get your information and how you will feed into the process helps to build that trust, but also helps to build a process that will be sustainable in the longer term. In my experience, governments have become really risk averse. They are scared of what communities will do with the information that they give them. And they want to actually put out the glossy document that tells the story that the government wants you to hear. The problem with that is communities immediately become suspicious and don't believe it unless they can see how it was developed. So it's really important to actually create that process and clarity of purpose about why you're doing things, who you're doing it with, and the process on which you will engage. So the fourth one is problem definition and joint discovery. Getting a clear understanding from everyone involved on actually what the problem is. Sitting in head office in Canberra, in government, saying there's a problem over there and we think we know how to fix it, so we're going to go and tell the community how we think it needs to be fixed, is not the way that communities will see it. Communities need to at first understand and agree on the definition of the problem and what we're trying to fix and why. And then we need to go through the process of joint discovery. Joint discovery on how big the problem is, who's impacted, and then a joint discovery on the science that we need to actually know how we're going to fix it, and then a joint discovery on what the solutions need to look like. I'll just go back to that one again. This is the kind of stuff that used to come out to our communities. Those kind of graphs and those kind of pictures and those kind of storytelling from a town hall up the front with these big PowerPoint presentations with lots of graphs and lots of numbers is not providing information to communities. That is not in a format that is going to provide clarity of understanding of the issues, and nor is it going to tell the story for those communities in how they need to work through the process and how they're going to be involved in the process. We need to do our storytelling a lot better. And that's not just from our politicians, but it's also from our researchers. Our researchers need to be able to engage with communities in a way in which communities will understand the speak. Time, flexibility and windows of opportunity, critically important. You need to give this time. The Basin Plan was actually first envisioned back in 2007. It took till 2012 to get the Basin Plan agreed, and we are still going through the process of implementing that Basin Plan. And you need to be adaptive. You need to actually stop and pause along the way, assess where you're going, and assess your success and your failings, and admit to your failings, move, change course, and then move forward again. Windows of opportunity also come along. The Millennium Drought was a great window of opportunity. There was a lot of people who had done a huge amount of work on what should be done to improve the basin, the Murray-Darling Basin, but were unable politically to get there to influence decisions. Because people don't often want to accept that change is necessary in an environment where you're telling them something might happen that they haven't seen happen before. They're not prepared to actually accept a hike in prices of water on something that might happen. But the moment you have something happening is the opportunity that you have to actually implement changes that previously you may not have been able to get through politically. So look for those windows of opportunity and be ready for them. The sixth one is decision-making and change management. We need to clearly demonstrate how the decision process will happen, how people will be involved in it, and we need to reflect the outcomes of the engagement process so people actually know what's being done with the information they're providing and how that has fed into the decision-making process. And that's a critically important element also. So at the end of the day, we have learnt in Australia that it is critically important to walk together, not alone. And walking together is something that Australia has not traditionally done well. And the second piece of work that the Australian Water Partnership has commissioned is around Indigenous voices and how we can better integrate Indigenous voices and Western science to walk together on developing what the next round of solutions will be and how we can meet the challenges that climate change will bring us. Working together, we're going to be better, and we can't thank the Australian Water Partnership enough for enabling us to be a part of this process and also enabling us to be here today. Okay, so our next speaker, we actually have a video now to show, and that video is from our one of our really young and upcoming stars. She's a that's actually, if I just go back to that for a minute. The Community Voices summary document can be found at that QR code. If anyone would like to learn more about the principles and how we develop those, it's available on the Australian Water Partnership website, and the full document will be published probably early next year. Okay. I just have to wake my machine up. Technology is great. Okay, so our next speaker is Safera Tagavini, who is the General Secretary from the Women's Forum in the Lau Province in the Fiji Islands. Safira is an amazingly inspirational woman, and she's going to talk to us about her story. Safira worked with the government of Fiji for about 18 years in administration and management. She was the Fiji recipient of the National Volunteer Award of Sustainable Livelihoods because of her work with the not-for-profit called Grace Triffin Ministry that she founded. So I'll now play the video for you.
Bula, my name is Safira Tangibuni. I am from Yandana, which is my village, and Lakemba is my district, and Lau is my province. The work that I'm doing for Grace Triffin Ministry is the work that I had a passion for. That's how we work with the community. They request, I will take it back to the provincial office. The provincial administration officer will deal with the district administration and the community leaders. Right? Once that road is clear, I am given the okay to go to the community. So we brought the NGO back to the community in the eastern side. That's where I was requested, and I was elected as the General Secretary for the Songsongwa Marama near Sanola, which is my province, which is my pride, which is the community I'm well acquired with their everyday needs and what's they're currently facing back on the island. So it was like a challenge, a real challenge for me, having to come back to my community because it's been a while. I've been doing work in other communities, and I haven't done any for my community. So having to be selected to be the General Secretary bring me back home, and it's still a challenge today because having to work with your own, it's not like easy as you think, because there is always questions on how you do things and why you do this. So it is a matter of working it from an association perspective. So I work with these associations and I help them put up their constitutions and their strategic plans. What I found now when I work with climate change, that this is a big issues that they have back home. That the communities in these 6 islands, they have a problem with water. They don't have any water sources. The water sources that they have is covered with tide when it's high tide, because they don't have enough land so that they can have any water source from that. So what they have is a little bit of piece of land plus surrounding with sea. These 6 islands are having the same problem. They have to wait for low tide to go and clean the water catchment in the sea so that they can have fresh water. And now that the government is supplying rain harvest water tanks, which are coming in Rotterdam. So they're sort of relying on this water tank, and they found out that because because they only will have to rely on the land on the rain, they have suddenly forgotten that their water catchment or their water sources is there, and they only go to the water sources when they have no rain. It is the fact that this Rotterdam tank is the only source of clean water that they have back on the island, and that's where they run to every time they want to drink. And it happens that my son was on the island. We were together on the island, but he was playing with the children in the school, and he was thirsty. Something that he forgot to take his water bottle with him. So he went to the water tank. He cupped the water, and he was about to drink. Then he thought it's his hand that smelled, so he washed the hands again and cupped the water again. And then he realized that it's not his hand; it's the water that is a stink. So he came and told me the water in that water tank is stink. So I worked it out with the village headman and said if we can go down to the village to the school. So we went together, and when they turned over the water tank, we found that there was a dead mouse inside the water tank. If this is the situation, and most of them never realize, so this is the problem they face with the Rotterdam water tank, and I'm sure this is what happened in all these communities, these island communities, because nobody check on the water tanks and nobody check on the roof of the house, depending whether it's rusty or whether it's dirt. They don't really care about it as long as there's water in the water tank. And when the water tank runs low, there's island communities because they believe and they trust in their God. They run into the church and they will pray for rain. And they will have weekly prayer for rain. And it's always at the end of the week there will be rain and there will be. So it is a norm to them. This is the situation they face every day. And I pray that we could help to these communities so that they are not disadvantaged, they are not left behind, they are not neglected of clean water sources that we can give them. And if we have to give them, then we have to give them soon, because the problem that they are facing back in their island and the kind of sickness that they have out of diarrhea and all this is to them is just a norm, because it is what they see for every day and they don't count it as anything. And we addressed this issue on World Cafe, then we found out that they realized, this is something that we never know. This is what we are used to. I said, then we addressed it. We requested the team from the Ministry of Health. We requested the team from the Fiji Water Authority, which is the authority that looks after the water problem in Fiji. And we requested the Environment Department to come so that when we sit together in the World Cafe workshop, then they came to realize that what they're facing is not a norm. It is a problem that needs to be addressed. If they have to have their children or they have to live longer, then we have to address soon this water problem that they're facing back on the island. We have to find inventions that can help them to have clean water access in their very own island. Who's listening? Who's listening out there? Who can give them a hand? Who can give them their rights so that they can have access to clean water? I'm begging, I'm pleading. If there's anybody out there who would help these communities realize their humanity rights, their humanitarian rights, please lend a hand. Please help. And I'm willing to reach them for you, to take you down, to go and have a feeling for them so that they can pay their respect and to thank you for their generosity for having to let them be.
Wow, what a powerful story. Sapphira's story tells us exactly what it is to have leaderful communities, what it is to have people in your communities who know those communities and can help those communities define and understand what their solutions are. Sapphira is the kind of leader that we should be developing in all our communities. Sapphira is also connected and reaching out to seek support from others. They have the solutions, they have the know-how, and they have the connection to community. They now need the resources to make it happen. So we really thank Sapphira for her genuine and honest representation of the kinds of issues that communities deal with and how simple it might be to solve those if we take a people-first approach. Okay, we now have another video for you from Sonia Cooper. And Sonia Cooper is a Yorta Yorta woman from Victoria in in Australia. It's me from South Australia saying that. It's Australia. She's from Victoria, and she is an amazing young woman and a young leader, Yorta Yorta woman. I've just got to reopen my system, sorry. So Sonia is someone who has worked in natural resources area for a very long time. She's got a strong interest in culture, the environment, science, policy, law, contracts and geopolitics. So she's got quite a list of achievements and experiences. She works in the Water and Climate Research Office for Yorta Yorta and is a great advocate for the progression of cultural rights and cultural justice. Sonia has been engaged to sit on various boards around the country, including the CSIRO's Indigenous Reference Group in 2019 and science panels during the past 10 years. So she's a wonderful influencer and a very strong leader in her local Yorta Yorta community, but she also reaches much further that and is a strong voice for Indigenous Australians. So we now have a video from Sonia.
I won't talk to the PowerPoint, but I just wanted you to see some images from my country. Our forest is dying. That was 3rd of February 2022. Not only do I have lots of photos, I've had lots of photos of all different things. You've got stagnant waters, you've got algal blooms happening in isolated spots. These, just going back to that, to this map here, Yorta Yorta conducted research around the soils. And we went through a 22 on the New South Wales side kilometres and 22 kilometres on the other side from Hawke's Bend all the way down to the exit of the Narrows at Barmer. And the research that we did was on 44 kilometres of soil, so on both sides of the river. And we looked at the soil, what was happening to our soils. A lot of people talk erosion but don't understand erosion. A lot of people talk climate change but have absolutely no idea what they're talking about, or we can't really link up what they're talking about. Next slide, thank you. The Murray, the banks of the Narrows, which would be referred to as the Barmer Choke, is at a mass failure. I mean, I'm talking about a mass failure upon a mass failure. The original banks where the vegetation would have been are completely gone. I don't even know where they were. Here you've got the undercutting. The undercutting goes up to 80 centimetres underneath. So if you put your hand underneath, be rest assured not to stand on that very edge part of the system. You've got different types of erosion, but you've got forces that create, like the velocity. you've got vertical velocities, you've got horizontal velocities happening, and then they combine and they create a force and eddies. This is in Hawke's Bend, Bitchener. Hawke's Bend is a really high-profile area. Those banks would be full and overflow now. But when you look at it, the clay and sand that you notice at the bottom of the exposed altered bank, this is not your original bank. Also, this was uplift as well. So you've got to be mindful that what's under the ground that gets lifted up and gets water onto it has a really different erosion rate, including with what's happening with the water. Next slide, please. Some of these images, this is all the way through my country. Look at what's happening to the tree roots. I mean, they can't even act as a conduit. Like they're not even connected to the soil. I mean, this is heartbreaking. And we tell people this is what you're doing to our country. Obviously the government, but we can't change that. In this system, I don't believe there's any hope for change. If someone wants to talk to me about that, you go right ahead. But what I'm seeing is really can't be changed. In fact, even if you try and bank up these banks, nothing's going to happen because water finds the level and water will find its way around. Not only do you have physical erosion, you've got chemical erosion happening. So there's multiple processes that is happening on our banks. Continue with the slide. We've done some soil reports. We've found, and just stop there for a second, but we've found that the soils are not hydrophobic at this stage. So they're not repelling water, which is a real good scientific indication to say to government, you need some more overbank flow just to cater for that element. I'm not even talking about anything else at this stage. When we look at the cracking clays on Yorta country, the cracking clays are undergoing a number of different changes. Higher temperatures and lower rainfall impact the cracking clays. That's been predicted now under the climate chapter for Australia for the next 5 years, for the lower parts of Australia. Trees can no longer sustain their position. They're falling over at a massive rate. There's more than 36 trees that have fallen since the water's been there. And I've got them on video as well as some more that are going to fall soon. By looking at the soil, I think what people do is look at water, for example, and they say, we need water to go there. But do they actually know what the water does? Do they know how the water fills the recharge zones? Do they know how the velocity works out of the recharge zones? Do they know how the water strips the clays? Do they know how black water works? Do they know how black water and the content of black water mixes with the clays? Does anyone know anything but, other than being out there? I was dismissed recently for not having, for providing some hypotheticals. I haven't got hypotheticals. I've got a lot of research and work that I've done out there on country for our people. And if people don't want it, that's fine, we've got it. This is how it feels like the heart hardens a little bit. But, to this picture here that you're looking at, I took that December last year. That was when there was no water. Actually, the water was up around September and then it went back down again in December. That image there is a demonstrative of that's a creek, that's the Broken Creek, that's Bala, and it's in trouble. All the creeks are in trouble. All the creeks are regulated, almost all of them. And there's lots happening. When you put water into a system that has lots of trees, then the trees drink, then the trees don't drink, and then they dry up in the dry weather, then they get wet in the rain, and then their limbs start falling because it's not really how they used to do things. It's really problematic. And the young trees, I don't believe are the original trees, but I believe that they're suffering as well. Also, I want to say is that to understand traditional knowledge is not easy. To really get to understanding it needs more time with traditional owners, not working across the platform with all different traditional owners, but really understanding what does it mean to us on country? What can we tell you is happening? Will you listen to us? And I think when organisations like the Australian Water Partnerships, and you've got University of Queensland, you've got Monash Uni at the time when they worked with us, and Engineers Without Borders work with us, and we've got lots of different organisations actually sitting with us, making a difference, it gives us the confidence to be able to be autonomous. And I think there's some real key take-home messages from all the presentations today. For me, the country is dying. I think everyone's just trying to save it. And I'm grateful for that because it's probably all we got left. When you look at it from above, from the skies in a plane, tears come to the eyes. It is absolutely sad. And then on the ground, everyone's fighting, saying that there's healthy country and things are changing. I think things are happening really on an isolated level, but I think we need to get real about, what it all means. So, traditional knowledge is not just traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge comes with a set of systems and ways of doing, and that is connected to the individual and to the nation. And I think people forget that because Indigenous knowledge, there is obviously no definition for that, but it's traditional knowledge belonging to traditional owners. And I'm not sure if I agree on that word. It's traditional knowledge belonging to us. So I ask that you open your hearts, work with traditional owners, just be honest, be open, and try not to come to us with already mandated or a dictated set of terms, because we'll shut shop on you pretty much. I know we will, but we are open, and we encourage you to contact any of us after this presentation.
Great. What a powerful story Sonia has to tell. And you can see what Sonia is doing there is she's blending Western science with an underpinning of traditional knowledge and trying desperately to bring the two together. Her experience has been one of frustration to date, but there is hope on the horizon. There is a very strong push now to ensure that the voices of our next generation of scientists that incorporate traditional knowledge into what they do as a fundamental part of their thinking can actually bring us to a way forward. So we really thank Sonia for her heartfelt presentation and for the way in which Sonia continues to fight, even though she gets very frustrated at times. She is a strong leader in our local communities, and not just our Indigenous community, our local communities, which includes all of us. So thank you, Sonia. Our next and final speaker is Dr. Virginia Marshall from the Wiradjuri Noongar country. Virginia's academic achievements are extensive and include the inaugural Indigenous Postgraduate Fellow at the Australian National University with the Schools of Regulation and Global Governance and the Fenner School of Environment and Science. Virginia is a solicitor, passionate about Indigenous rights, and is involved in numerous high-level committees and panels. Dr. Virginia Marshall is an influencer. She's a big, important leader in our communities with a fascinating story to tell. Over to you, Virginia.
Thank you. Well, it's really amazing to come and present to you and talk with you about the opportunities that can be had. I certainly want to, like Phil has acknowledged, the people of Egypt. We're really, really thrilled that we have been hosted. I was also at Glasgow last year. So again, more work to do from last year to this year, and also honour the Indigenous peoples on Egypt, on this land that's hosted us. So we really thank you, and thank you for your open heart. And also, I think that it's really important, Marangyaria, to say that as Indigenous peoples of Australia, we have all different stories. And the reason I find it's really interesting that Kaylene's really been able to describe some of the issues with the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. When I first started academia, I had 4 children and I had 4 years of high school. So that was very challenging. I did 6 degrees in 5.5 years. And I did a PhD. I've just come out of 5 years of a postdoc and now research fellow on an Australian Research Council grant, which is one of the most prestigious, to work on Aboriginal-led traditional medicines. And it's only through hard work and support of my family and also community. So that's why I'm standing here today. So I just wanted to acknowledge that the love of my life was the doctoral thesis. Not so much, I think it was very scary when I first started to think that you could write 110,000 words, which culminated in 250,000 words by the time I'd finish, because there was so much to talk about. As you know, there's so much in the water space to write about. When you're given even 3,000 words, it's not enough. So this became, I won the Stanner Award, which is the National Thesis Award in Australia, and I just brought one copy. I gave away one copy yesterday to a panellist member, So I have one copy if someone dearly wants to read it and use it. There's 2 chapters in here on the Murray-Darling Basin and the issues that I really saw were problematic, not only as a countryman, as an Indigenous woman, but also on the issues of government and the lack of engagement. And as we realise in Australia, both Phil and I sit on the Committee on Aboriginal Water Interests. We've been extended for 2 years. That's under the Australian government, so we're frank and fearless, and we're providing this information with many other countrymen. And that's really exciting because for the first time we've got an opportunity to actually revamp, to reform the National Water Initiative, which is the blueprint of Australian water resources and how it's managed. It's very much a huge responsibility because it means that we have to also look at what issues need to be changed, and one of those is looking at Indigenous values in the water system. The problem was in 2004, and I'll be going on to talk about Indigenous medicines in a moment, but in 2004 the government of the day, the national government, decided to separate water from the land, and that would be an anathema for us and has been. Because we have Gender Day only yesterday, and we know that Aboriginal women and Torres Strait Islander women are the strength behind everything. Also, as you've seen with Sapphira, the water use, water protection, raising families, instilling women's business and knowledge within the children and also within the community. So we play a really important role, and women all over the world are underestimated. And it's certainly the fact that Indigenous women are underestimated and the role that they play. So we have to be very, very clear that we need to really honour not only our communities, but the people that went before us. So this document also really relays the way that we see water. As Sapphira said, you know, some people really believe if you give a water tank that you've actually solved the problems of a community. And I know growing up that we only had cold water in one place and we had mosquitoes coming out of that tap. And the water was boiled and you drank the mosquitoes and the water. And I also relate to that example in the water tank where it was a mouse for Sapphira, but I can remember a bird being in the water tank and having that smell. So, you know, we've got to realise that sometimes when we feel that we've got the right answers to solve the problems of Indigenous Australia, that you really probably haven't talked to the right people. That's the community themselves. So that's a really important situation that we need to take on board. But, you know, we also need to talk to the women with a women's representative coming to the community when you're invited, and a man for the men's business. So, you know, it's very gendered, we know that. And it's very important to acknowledge that we need to have that space. And then, of course, the young people are coming on board. So this work has been a love of my life, and it continues. Water security is a big issue in Egypt. It's a big issue over in the Middle East, and I've done a lot of transboundary work as well. And also written with quite a number of scientists from Fenner School in the ANU. I have good news that I will be supervising Sonia at the Australian National University, so really excited about that. And I actually have supervision next year for a University of Oxford Doctor of Philosophy coming over, which I'll supervise early next year as well. So, you know, there is some great things to happen when you think you're only a mum with 4 children. So there are some great things that do come out of this. So what I'd like to talk about now is to go to the first slide. As I mentioned, my Australian Research Council grant, which will be over 3 or 4 years, has a great team. I've worked for the last 12 years as volunteer lawyer on intellectual property, establishing collaboration agreements. This is besides my court work this year on native title. So I had 6 weeks in the federal court as instructing solicitor. This is wonderful because this is what Phil and I love. Mum Annie, Annie Milgan, is one of the senior cultural bosses that I work for, and she's on board on the project that I'm doing. She'll be assisting with having participants come on board, and also with her husband, John Watson. I work with him extensively and have done in the past 12 years as the volunteer lawyer. And seed collection, as you can see. The women in the Kimberley and this community have gathered seeds. And, you know, we might think a packet of seeds is just a packet of seeds, but it has life, it has knowledge, it has the transmission with the young people. So it's just not seeds. And it's also regrowing those really important plants that have cultural stories. So they have creation stories. How did this particular plant happen? And who has the ownership on that story, that creation story? So in our team, we have medical anthropologists that will be looking at that, namely because we have, like the FDA in America, we have the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which regulates the use of medicines, toxicology, the safety, etc. So we're going to establish a way forward for the TGA that they don't have at the moment. They don't have a framework that respects and really acknowledges oral evidence. And we know under the native title legislation of 1993 Commonwealth that oral evidence given by an Aboriginal claimant is not hearsay. So it's admissible. It's tested in cross-examination, which is important, but it is accepted. Now, the TGA doesn't accept oral evidence. It accepts Ayurvedic, which is written information from India. It accepts Chinese medicine because it's written over 2,000 years. But what we say is that, and this is by carbon dating, by a piece of an axe head in Western Australia, it puts Aboriginal people in Australia at 80,000 years. And that's phenomenal. So we're the oldest living, surviving culture in the world. And, you know, I'm always amazed when I come here to COP that we aren't celebrated much more and that we aren't really sharing with you and communicating with you across the world about what we know, how we do find water, how we've always found water. We never survived on country, we lived. And we know this. Even the old people will tell you today with those bioindicators with climate change, there is so much to be learnt by really reading the land. And I felt that that's one of the great traditions that we can share, but it does come at building those trusted relationships that we spoke about this morning, because if we don't build those trusted relationships on the protocols of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, then we're not going to go forward. So I think we have a lot to benefit the world. I think our stories, the information that we have gathered over lifetimes. Remember that Eddie Mabo, when he was in the stand for his case, and he wasn't one of the participants at that time for cultural reasons, but Eddie Mabo restated 17 generations of his family, grandmothers and grandfathers. So that was memorised. So that shows you how amazing our traditions are. This is an example of Bruno Dan. He's a Nyul man in the Kimberley. And garbinge is a really a very amazing antioxidant. The reason that garbinge is really important is even the Wolverine, Hugh Jackman, was actually interested in investing in garbinge because he could see that there was so much to be gained by getting involved with a drink that was using garbinge. Mary Quant years ago actually took our knowledge without asking us, and many people actually go on tour buses to take some leaves or specimens to take back home, which, you know, as we know, is not legal, but this is still going on. So a lot of issues about biopiracy is still happening. It's alive and well in Australia. And land care activities. You know, the whole thing, and Phil can tell you this, we need to be on country and traditional owners need to be on country because it's part and the main part of our identity. So when you're a saltwater person, you need to be on country to have that salt water on your skin, in your body. It's part of your health regime, so to speak. And if you're a freshwater man or a woman, exactly the same reason. You need that part. If you're a desert person, you need that as part of your identity to be on country. You know, many people in Australia just sell up their homes and move down the south coast or up to the north in the Kimberley, and they're moving in someone else's country. And yes, it feels wonderful, or the rush of the salt water in the sea, but we're talking about health and well-being. So that's really so important. And many of these plants, like the one that I'm working on as an example, to build this knowledge, this toolkit for communities so they can lead their Aboriginal medicines themselves, and if they want to commercialise them. These salt bushes, there's over 180 different salt bushes, and we've used them. And on Maori country, I know when I went out there, many of our community members there said, these are fantastic. You know, salt bushes, why wouldn't we use them, you know, when we're walking through country and it's very arid? So there's all of these potentials for topical creams. Pharmaceuticals is a hugely expensive operation, and only big players really have those opportunities. So, you know, at least the one particular plant that I've been working with John Watson and Annie Milgan, it was the first patented plant in Australia. So that's really important. As we know, Australia hasn't ratified the Nagoya Protocol. They should immediately. But the other thing is that customary law is in operation. Because we use those obligations, we implement those conventions and declarations like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So those are customary laws, they're obligations from Australia's position, and that's why this is so important. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity is really intrinsic, and it works with water. This is not disengaged. Climate change is engaged with the biological diversity issues because Australia is a hotspot for biodiversity, but we're extinguishing plants and animals at an intolerable rate. We just seem to be developing and clearing land, sometimes building houses for reasons that are beyond most of us, and why, and the size of the houses. Some of us here remember 2 or 3 bedroom houses, or even two bedroom houses, but we're getting these mega mansions and these big places on small pieces of land. So, you know, this is also affecting the way we can actually use our lands and waters and our plants and our traditional medicines because of the rate of clearing. And another thing is too, we know, especially for the Kimberley, there's a problem that World Heritage can also allow extractive industries there. So you might have a World Heritage status, but it means that it's not protected. So, you know, that's also an issue. And we know that fresh water, groundwater is being used for dust suppression by mining industries. And it's really ridiculous. In our time, Phil and I's, you didn't buy bottled water. You didn't buy bottled water. You drank out of a tap or you drank out of a well. But this whole phenomena, which is hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, that takes water from one place where Aboriginal communities, for example, in New South Wales and the Kimberley, have had to call on bottled water from another place, but we never know where the origin, where the source, where the community that water came from in Australia. And, you know, those are sort of the issues that we're dealing with. So we're dealing with issues to do with plastics and the plastic bottle that has the water inside. But for us, we're concerned about the water and where it comes from and the origin. You know, we need to know these things, and it's not on any of the bottles. And have a read tonight, something that's missing. So we have a lot of examples. The Nagoya Protocol, as I said, You know, there's benefit sharing agreements that can be had out of the Nagoya Protocol. The process is not always smooth sailing. Number one, because Indigenous communities in Australia don't always have legal counsel on hand. They have to rely to pro bono, and I do a significant amount of pro bono work, but, you know, we need to have lawyers on tap that can really provide the information going into those agreements, and many times they don't. And that is also a huge issue of equity, you know, and also really, you know, affirming these different issues that we've got here and the articles that are set out. We know that in practical terms they don't always work because there's a lack of capacity, not enough legal information that's provided directly to the community and guiding them through these issues. For example, the Indian database that they have on various traditional plants and medicines is also not 100% foolproof because it's managed outside of Indigenous communities. So I've been on this for a long time and a long journey, and UNDRIP, yes, it really is a good working document, but we also have to go back to what Phil said, and what I'm saying is you have to go back to the protocols of the community. So it's not just really using only the conventions and declarations, but understanding that every language group in Australia has different protocols, different laws, and that might be that you might have success in one community, but then you have to relearn those protocols and that trust, as Kayleen was talking about, with another community. So it doesn't give you a carte blanche. It's challenging, but it's something we have to do when we work with other groups. So we have to concede that we're on different territory, we might have relationships, but we also need to start from ground zero. Again, you know, this is from John Watson, as the senior cultural boss, one of very few now that are still standing, and he also was the main applicant for John Watson versus Western Australia. That was a successful native title decision. It was hard won over 17 years. You know, you wouldn't imagine a criminal case to last 17 years. You'd certainly think it would be quicker, but I can tell you the amount of evidence that an Aboriginal claimant group or respondent requires is quite lengthy, quite costly, emotionally costly, and it was hard won. So John Watson created a community where people can actually be on country, and that is one of his success stories as a man in his 80s. Again, another example, we know with the fires in Australia in 2019 was horrific. We know that there's been other fires. I've been watching them in California and many other places across the world. They've actually sought really help from Indigenous peoples in Australia. Botswana has also found a lot of knowledge from us, and American tribes have also really come to Indigenous peoples of Australia to really relearn how to do cool fire practices, to burn without burning the crown of the trees and taking everything with it, the animals, etc. It's unique, but again, we need to make sure that we don't lose control and management of those practices, because it still remains Indigenous knowledge with those communities. So it's not like coming out and buying it at the supermarket and buying that knowledge or that participation. There has to be really trusted relationships and also opportunities for fee for service for those Aboriginal communities, because there are very few livelihoods that we have left. And traditional medicines, bush foods, culture and heritage, a whole range of those issues are still there for livelihoods for Indigenous peoples of Australia. But again, another example, Eugene Bargo I work with, I've taken him to the Kimberley with his son Carl. Eugene's an amazing man because he's walked the boundaries of his traditional country, and he knows his barramundi dreaming. He takes people from all over the world to really get to know about Indigenous Australia. And, you know, that's a credit to people, and Phil knows many people of country that do this work. He lives in a little cabin, doesn't have electricity, Not long ago, it had a very long, very large king brown snake. So it used to actually live there as a baby, and it then came into the cabin, and bit by bit, when it got larger as a mature king brown, it actually was sleeping at the bottom of his bed. So there was one stage that he thought, I think we better part the relationship. And it's really important because that is his totem, right? So, you've got that dilemma, how do we sort of part with some sort of dignity for both sides? It was a great story. I really, it was amazing. So here we are, the national territory and the Northern Territory that we, so to speak, with, they've given away a lot of water to non-Indigenous people. They've given water away to large industries, almond farming, etc. Aboriginal people in New South Wales have been protesting with other NGOs on fracking. We got a lot of information a few years ago. It wasn't great. We got counter-information that said, this was going to be a really important part of the economy. But Phil could also share with those stories. They've been really problematic because they use and they also poison fresh water and groundwater. So, those sort of issues abound. Again, mining per se, uranium's up and running. And I can see when I've walked over to the nuclear stand here at COP again, they were there last year at Glasgow, that there is this momentum building and people are starting to say that it's safe. Well, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people know in cultural terms, the old people always said that country was sick country, cultural sickness. And that is something we take with us. And we know when you dig it out of the ground, you can have a look at all the Ranger mine evidence up in the Northern Territory, is the poisonings, the cancer, all of those sort of issues. They're not emotional, they're just a fact. They're just medical facts. And that's the problem. And the other issue is decommissioning those nuclear energy buildings, and also it's you can't see tailings when they go through the air. So there's a lot of issues that have already been out there and outlined. Again, there's that strength growing to really extend these issues, which will affect our medicines, which will affect our bush foods. And you might think that, having an endangered species such as a goanna, just we'll put that out there, if Aboriginal people who are able to eat that goanna is their staple diet, that will make a huge issue, a health issue for Aboriginal people, as it will for the Torres Strait Islander people. And we know that the Torres Strait Islands are really impacted with rising sea levels. So when they're not able to eat the produce from their area that they have done for thousands of years, that is going to be a direct health impact. So it's not just a species. This is something that we need culturally to eat, whether it's the salt bush, whether it's certain plants from Phil's country and medicines. There's community members that are not wanting to commercialise their particular plants or their medicines or bark. They want to use it just in-house in community clinics, in nursing clinics. So, those are the things we have to remember. They're not optional. It's not the same as having a Western antiseptic, a Western drug. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need these to survive, to live, to do women's business, to do men's business. So we're not just talking about a plant or a tree or an animal. This is really important. So another thing that I do is I sit on the Australian National University's Ethics Committee and have done since, I think, 2018. I was appointed by the Australian National University to lead the Indigenous group for ethics. I found it really, really interesting when I started this, because many companies seem to opt out of their moral obligations, moral rights, for example, under intellectual property, and also legal rights, and also not incorporating the ICIP. so those international obligations to intellectual property, and also not remunerating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, or doing so very small amounts. And that not acknowledging, and this is one of the issues that we had in Glasgow in the plenary, is that the IPCC reports that provide the current data for scientists do not have lead authors who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples. So that was one issue that was pointed out very clearly in Glasgow. And we need to make sure that what Phil and I know is that Indigenous knowledge is science. It's tested, it's analysed, it's used, we know about its toxicology, we know about its safety. So all of those things we've done. And even in the early days with naturopathy, for example, you test on a part of the skin to see if it's going to be irritated, and we've done that for millennia. So we need to understand that the information that we hold, the knowledge that we hold, the law that we hold, is something that's going to help everyone sitting in this audience. If you want to avail yourself of that particular medicine, whether it's a topical or down the road or a very long road with pharmaceuticals. So we need to really understand that you are invested in what I'm doing and what others like me are doing in Australia. So again, this is John Watson on the left. He's not just showing the water or the fish. This is a cultural expression. This is a cultural learning space. And I've watched it with my own eyes over the past 12 years of how we teach knowledge in the Kimberley and how we teach knowledge. Phil could tell you that as well. So this is the place, transmitting knowledge, talking language, expressing the law in language, and that's why Indigenous languages are so critical for us especially, because when we look at the water, we see the living, breathing elements of our identity. And the expression is not just saving the pandanus, it's really making sure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are in the driver's seat, that we're driving, we're informing, because many times governments don't have Indigenous drafters, they don't have Indigenous policy officers that are there that really fully understand what's going on. So we need to be there, we need to be consulted meaningfully, but we need to direct traffic. That's a good outcome for everyone here in this room, because we know country, we know the water, we know the medicine, we know the language. Even though we've had that colonisation, as you've said, over 233 years, it's ravaged much of the countryside. In the first couple of years, the tank stream in Sydney, which is called Wadden in Dharawal language, it was only a couple of years and it was polluted and drunk, never to be seen again. There's only a trickle. I've been right up to the top when I was a National Parks Ranger, right up to the top of where salt water meets fresh water, and the trickling of that Yarra Bay area is just a very spiritual experience, but also to know in a couple of years the white settlers had ruined all of that water source. So, there are good stories, but there are stories that we need your help with. And especially when you do want to seek relationships with us, that you come to us. And we'll very gladly put out the welcome mat for those trusted relationships to begin. Mananguwa, thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. And I think Virginia has really clearly outlined for us the complexity of the systems we're working in and the complexity of the relationships that we need to continue to develop and the complexity of co-designing what the solutions are going to be. It's not an all bad story. We have seen expressed here a number of the challenges that we need to actually address, not only in Australia but globally, around water management and embracing community voices which include Indigenous voices. But we're on our way, we're on our path, and there is hope. And we have had some enormous successes in Australia also that have demonstrated that there is a way forward. And I really look forward to working with my fellow community members, my brother, Phil, Virginia, and various others in our communities to help us to meet those challenges, and particularly the challenges of climate change head on. I think we've probably got time for one question. Does anyone have a question of any of our panellists in the audience? Yes?
Thank you. I'm Victoria Gutierrez. I work for the Common Land Foundation. We're based in the Netherlands, and we apply the 4 returns framework to ecosystem restoration at landscape scale. And we have a process that is very much about co-development, co-creation, co-visioning, that is non-linear with grassroots. It includes Aborigines. There's a project in Australia, in Western Australia, with the Noongar land business group. And it speaks very much to what you've been all talking about, and the importance of, there are some very good examples of local leadership doing all these things in Australia, of course, but also globally, because this is it's a global issue, of course. So thank you so much. It's very, very good to hear.
Thank you so much for sharing with us your journey too, and your story about how the Netherlands is approaching these really complex issues. I'd just like to now to go to Phil, perhaps to wind up for us and to actually help us round out the conversation today. Over to you, Phil.
The nothing about us without us? So, Marabou, my sisters, Marabou, that's in my language, that's thank you. What a privilege to share the stage with 2 powerful women. And thank you, Virginia, for reinforcing, and Carleen. Women's voices are somewhat missed in the conversation, not at the table, always in a position of strength. And yes, Virginia, it is the centrality, that women are the central focus of our communities, with all communities, not just Indigenous communities. Collaboration, I hope there's a clear message here that we are all going to be moving forward globally with less and less resources, as in money. But that shouldn't be the issue that does not connect us. What should connect us is our knowledge and our willingness to share that knowledge. It's something that I asked you, throw a challenge out to you. It's the challenge that we grapple with every day in Sydney, in Australia. And we're getting better at it. We are definitely getting better at it. And it is something that we know can be the very game changer. We approach every day with discovery, a wondering mind on how we can be better together. And I want to say to the people in this room, becoming a network of networks and using our knowledge to connect one another, that's something that we can do. The head, heart, and the hands is something that I use. We have all this knowledge. We have this passion, a range of emotions. What are we willing to take each other's hands? Not just talk the talk, but walk the walk together. And look together at the future through the eyes of our next generations. Because we are currently being judged by the state of the environment we leave them, both culturally and from a whole of community perspective. And I say, I love sharing the stage with you, my sister. We're 30-year collaboration, and, what a powerhouse. So to you and everybody in this room, and those that have joined us virtually, I say, Marabou, which is thank you, safe travels, look after yourselves, look after community, until we meet again,
Thank you, Phil. And thanks again to the Australian Water Partnership for making this possible. Thank you.